Hi there, welcome to History of Thought 2, and today we're going to talk about Freud. Woohoo! So I would highly recommend that before you watch this, watch the two recommended, or I'm sorry, the two required videos. So the School of Life Freud and the School of Life Sublimation, and they're actually linked to um, in the weekly work outline before this lecture. So go back, they're pretty short, watch both of those because then the rest of this lecture will make a lot more sense. And a lot of the concepts are explained in a bit more detail in those lectures. So go watch them and then come back. Okay, you're back? Good. So Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist, physiologist, medical doctor, psychologist, and philosopher, and probably in terms of philosophy, one of the most well-known and controversial psychologists and philosophers in the 20th century. He's the founder of psychoanalysis, a clinical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalyst, so talk treatment. That's basically what he creates and popularizes. And this instituted an entirely new approach to the understanding of human psychology and the human personality. And he's regarded as one of the most influential and, as I said, controversial minds of the 20th century, particularly because of his ideas regarding the importance of the unconscious in influencing human behavior. Freud was born in 1856, in what was then the Austrian Empire. Today, it's the country of Austria. His father was a merchant, so they were considered middle class, and he spent most of his youth and adult life in the city of Vienna, a very cosmopolitan city at the time, full of culture and the arts and science, a very vibrant and lively city. Freud's family was Jewish, but he himself was non-practicing or secular. So Freud began his studies in medicine at the University of Vienna, and after graduating, he worked at the Vienna General Hospital. So he had a traditional medical school education. But during his hospital work, he started becoming interested in collaborating with another doctor who was treating what was seen as hysteria by using hypnosis to help patients sort of recall and get through painful experiences. And this inspired Freud to study human psychology. So he went to Paris for a year to study under the famous neurologist Jean Charcot. And on his return to Vienna, Freud set up his private practice, specializing in nervous and brain disorders. And he has this private practice for the rest of his life. And that same year, he married Martha Bernays, with whom he had 6 children throughout his life. So besides private practice, Freud was a professor of besides his private practice, he was a professor of neuropathology at the University of Vienna for over 3 decades. However, the end of his life was not so happy. In 1933, the Nazi regime in neighboring Germany rose to power, and his books were targeted. A number of his books were publicly burnt because he was Jewish. In 1938, shortly after the Nazis annexed Austria and made it part of sort of the Nazi Empire, Freud fled Vienna for London with his wife and one of his children, his daughter Anna. He unfortunately never got to return to Vienna, and he died in exile in London in 1939. And he actually died of cancer of the jaw, which is something he had for a number of years later in life, which was incredibly painful. Too many cigars, right? So I want to go over a few sort of central Freudian concepts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of these, but I just kind of want to go over all of these a bit so we have kind of a basic overview of Freud, although you'll get some of them in the videos. So, hold on. One of the central concepts for Freud is the idea of the pleasure principle, that we seek easy and physical and emotional rewards and try hard to avoid unpleasant experiences. Right? So this is sort of a central psychological aspect of human psychology for Freud, this pleasure principle, right? And it really comes from the primitive, the instinctual, and by primitive we mean like at a previous point in human evolution. So this isn't about like human culture. This is about sort of evolution. So it comes from this primitive, instinctual, animalistic part of the brain. Sometimes I like to call it the lizard brain. Hunger, thirst, anger, sex drive, all this kind of stuff. Freud will also call this the id. And typically a lot of this is unconscious. But, of course, no constraints on these drives, no constraints on us pursuing the pleasure principle unabashedly can lead to negative outcomes, especially in regards to being able to live with and get along with each other, living in a community, living with other human beings. So really kind of a central question, and this is something that Civilization Its Discontents will get at, is how do we adapt our behaviors and our desires in order to live in social groups? So, there's kind of this corollary to the pleasure principle, which is the reality principle, that we defer gratification in our wants and desires due to the obstacles of reality. Right. So we can't just all go running around saying, I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to hit whatever I want. I'm going to do nasty, naughty things with whomever I want, regardless of what they want. Right. Obviously, we can't live this way. We have to live in groups. We have to be social animals. So how do we defer these gratifications? How do we live in this reality? And Freud would say there's a lot of ways that humans go about doing this. And there are much better ways and much worse ways of doing this. And neuroses, for Freud, are consequences of the negative or the worst ways of repressing our desires associated with the pleasure principle. When you sort of repress what you need to repress, to be able to live with other people. If you do this improperly, then that's when you get what he would term neuroses. So things that we see manifested as anxieties, phobias, OCD, poor impulse control, depression, all of these things for Freud clinically, he sees as coming from sort of people not repressing their drives that come from the pleasure principle well. So you guys watched, the second video you watched was sublimation. So this is really important. I'm going to explain a little bit, but the video does a great job. And sublimation for Freud is the process by which we put our destructive impulses, those impulses from the pleasure principle, which aren't productive to us living healthily with ourselves or with others, like how we put those destructive impulses to productive use. So this is the best way of sort of dealing with our desires. So a desire looked down upon by society gets rerouted into seeking compensation in acceptable ways. So we cannot completely get rid of these impulses, this sort of what our lizard brain is telling us what to do, what Freud in a second I'll explain calls the id. But they are sort of rerouted into more productive avenues of expression. So from the video, Freud talks about, there was a child who was interested in had an impulse to be destructive and to be harmful to animals, who grows up and as an adult to become a skilled surgeon. So this individual sublimated those destructive impulses as a child into something sort of productive that made them happy and well adjusted. So from a Freudian perspective too, many of our creative endeavors in the arts are about sublimation, healthy or acceptable outlets for our impulses. So we don't deny those impulses, but we redirect them in the best ways that we can. So Freud obviously is known a lot for his sort of childhood development theories and his focus on the development of the self in childhood. He's famous for Freud's phases of psychosexual development, right? Oral, anal, phallic. He's famous for sort of the Oedipus complex, that male children secretly want to have sex with their mother and kill their father, ideas about penis envy. Like, these are all kind of controversial, and I think some of them are pretty outdated. They're not as important here for our purposes. I think the generous reading of Freud, the broader reading of Freud, would say that our personality and our moral consciousness and our neuroses are based in our childhood experiences, and that how the family is structured in a culture contributes tremendously to the different ways our desires become manifest as neuroses, or of how we learn to sublimate properly. The kids are, I mean, I have a couple little kids, especially like really young kids. They're kind of little sociopaths, right? So the process of sort of balancing our kind of more primal sort of desires, right? The pleasure principle, eat, hit, sleep, balancing that and sort of balancing all of the rules that we've internalized from society when you're a child, like from your parents, from your caregivers, from school, sort of balancing all of that and successfully sort of negotiating all of that's really a key and critical moment in our development. And it's tremendously important in terms of who we are psychologically as adults and whether we have a lot of neuroses or we sublimate well. And so I think that's the generous reading of Freud. We can kind of dispense with the Oedipus complex and all that stuff and seeing it maybe as a relic of a particular construction of the middle class bourgeois family that he was seeing at that time, and not something that's universal. But what is universal is that childhood is overwhelmingly important in our psychological development. So, something that is really important, though, and we've kind of touched a little bit on it, is Freud's personality structure. And this is the id, ego, superego model. And Freud explains this famous model for brain function in his 1927 publication, The Ego and the Id. And since then, this theory has sort of has become so widely known. But if you've never encountered this before, let me explain it. And I'm going to explain it with sort of this, sometimes it's explained with this horse and chariot metaphor. So you can, look at the slide, but also I'll explain it a different way. So the id is what's trying to satisfy the pleasure principle, right? It's the unevolved instinctive part of our brain. It's responsible for the urges and the desires that we're trying to repress, right? That's our lizard brain, right? That's that lizard brain that's saying like, eat, drink, hit, screw, 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 or whatever. You can kind of think of the id as the horse, right? It's just going, just sort of instinctually riding off. It's left the gate, it's going. The ego I'm sorry, let's go to the superego. The ego is kind of you could think of it as the driver, right? The driver of the carriage. If the horses are just going, right? The ego is the driver, the person that's kind of in the part of our brain that's the conscious part of our brain that's in control. And this is where the reality principle comes in. It's trying to satisfy all of these urges from the id, but in realistic ways, right? It's able to guide the id, but the ego never has full control. So just as like the driver of the carriage is aware that if the horse wants to go in a different direction really badly, the horses get like spooked by something and run off in a different direction. It's probably the driver, the ego, is ultimately powerless to stop it. The horses are going to go that way if they really strongly want to. But the ego's still there driving things most of the time and trying to rein in or trying to deal with the pleasure principle through the reality principle. The superego is kind of our voice of conscious, the voice of our conscience. It's the part of us that's internalized sort of the rules of society. Think of it as like the parent of the wagon driver sitting behind them, pointing at all the mistakes. Like, well, you better direct the horses this way, and well, you're not doing it right, and you should do it this way, blah, blah, blah. So it's the part of our brain that's responsible for criticizing and moralizing. And of course, this develops while we're a child as we're sort of internalizing all of the rules of society that we're learning from our families and from school and all of this kind of stuff. So the ego is sort of our rational brain, and it's constantly sort of dealing with all this stuff in the unconscious that's coming up from the id, all the pleasure principle, like I have these desires, satisfy them right now, whatever, as well as sort of all of these, like that stern parent standing behind you from the superego saying, you better do this, you didn't do this right, follow the rules. So, the ego is sort of that rational self that's negotiating it in the middle. Just note that our common language use of the word ego is different than Freud's use. So if we say, someone has an ego or they're egotistic, we're referring to their self-esteem. But Freud's definition simply means that this sort of conscious part of our brain that's trying to sort of negotiate between the id and the superego, right? So Freud believed that as babies, all of our behavior is ruled by the id, right? When we're born, we're animals, right? This is where our basic survival instincts are located and where our desire for pleasure seeking comes from. It's in the id. So as we get older, our ego develops and is shaped by influences in our environment, such as family, friends, culture, societal norms, and the superego too is developing, right? Sort of the internalization of rules and of moralizing. So the human psyche is a constant interplay between these forces. Relatively healthy development means you learn to sublimate the impulses of the id and not just repress them. Don't just shove it all down, but deal with it and deal with it in a healthy way. It's also about healthy development is letting the superego have its say, listen to the rules, listen to sort of the moralizing, but not being so strict about its moralizing that it's a straitjacket. Of course, this is really hard to do, but we try, right? We try. So for today, you guys read an excerpt from Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, which is an application of Freud's ideas about individual psychology to the level of human cultures and human civilization as a whole. So this is really about applying kind of the notion of the pleasure principle and the reality principle and sublimation and the ego, superego, id to entire cultures, entire societies. This is one of his last works, very late in his career. He wrote it in 1930 and he died in 1939. So Freud wants to know, why are human beings often so miserable, even in modern civilized society? When he's writing this in 1930, that's 90 years ago. But even then, think of all of the benefits of kind of modern industrial society and all of the incredible things that people have. But, even 90 years later, it's still an important question. Why are we still often so miserable with living with all of these incredible things? So the central problem in human society that human society must deal with, according to Freud, is how to maintain a balance between two things. One, individual liberty and freedom on the one hand, and two, protecting the group as a whole. So really it's the struggle between the individual and society. And Freud sees this as somewhat parallel between the struggle between sort of the id and the superego and the ego negotiating it in an individual. Now, I want to be clear about Freud's use of the word civilized. So a more, quote, civilized society for Freud are the ones where the instinctual desires of individuals, so the sort of society level id, revenge, greed, wanting to have sex with whomever they want to, are not just managed, but actually sublimated into more socially acceptable and community-minded outcomes like justice, peace, generosity, artistic creativity, respecting others. So the use of the word civilization for Freud is not some kind of nascent racist hierarchy with Western industrial countries on top, as many at his time would use the word, right? Rather, Freud would say some modern cultures in the West are really, really neurotic and bad at creating a system that encourages people to sublimate well. So civilization is really about just collective human societies and who does good and who does bad at this. So, in Civilization and its Discontents, there are two major drives of the human libido. So this is kind of taking apart the id a little bit more for Freud, which he identifies as Eros and Thanos. And so, we're going to look at how Freud defines each of these central drives of the human libido. So Eros, which he actually had talked about up to this point in previous work, is the love drive. This is the desire of an ego to connect itself to an object outside of itself. So this isn't just about like falling in romantic love. It's a very sort of simplistic view of it. But this is about sort of connecting to something greater, feeling like you're a part of something, feeling like you're a part of a collectivity. And the object that connect to can be a person, but it could also be a thing or a group of people, like a community or a culture. Um, and this is connected to the pleasure principle, right? The desire for life, the desire for loving others and being loved, the desire for creativity and satisfaction. So in a society, the love drive, eros, manifests itself as the desire to create bonds with other people, to sustain relationships, to create community. This is the glue that holds society together for Freud. However, there's also another impulse, which is Thanatos, the death drive, the desire to break, to undo, to destroy. So in a society, this manifests, and you know, in the ego, or I'm sorry, in an individual human, right? These would be sort of destructive impulses in the id, right? Wanting to sort of be violent, wanting to hit things, wanting to yell, wanting to tear things apart. So at a societal level, this manifests as a desire to break down the bonds between people, to destroy aspects of the world around the self, even to destroy the self. I mean, this can be physically, right? This can be physical violence, but this can be psychologically too. And you really witness its work when societies carry out large-scale violence and destruction, right? So war, he would see as sort of having this impulse underlying it. You know, what's really interesting is that this is, you know, Freud has written a lot up to this point. This is one of his last books. And this is really the first time that Freud has described an innate death drive in his work. He's described sort of, you know, the love drive, pleasure principle, all this stuff. But, you know, a lot of people have speculated, you know, why does he kind of add this now? I mean, it helps the story of civilization as discontents. But you could say, okay, he's dying of an incredibly painful cancer when he's writing this, but think about what he's witnessing. You know, he's witnessing sort of uh, the rise of fascism, the spread of anti-Semitism across Europe. He's sort of witnessing the beginnings of World War II, and sort of saying, hey, you know, we supposedly have all this great stuff in modern Western civilization, but there's a lot of sort of destruction and destructive impulses and hate as well, right? So, how does Freud believe that people can maintain civil societies in spite of the presence of this death drive? I mean, obviously, the eros, the love drive, is sort of giving people impulses to form bonds and form communities, but there's also this equally strong sort of tearing stuff apart drive. So how do humans maintain civilized in Freudian sense societies given the existence of desire and drives antithetical to the social cohesion? So not just the death drive, but other kinds of drives. You know, that would make getting along in society really hard. I mean, really, this question is, why do people most of the time, follow the rules? I mean, think about it. You know, there's lots of rules that you have internalized that you just simply follow all the time, right? You know, do you cross the street in the middle of the road, or do you cross at the crosswalk? And if you cross at the crosswalk most of the time, why? I mean, Freud would say it's internalized discipline, that we internalize the rules constructed by society and mostly self-regulate their behavior, right? Internalizing those rules, that's the superego, and the ego is kind of balancing that internalization of rules with these more baser drives. You know, some people would say, oh, I follow the rules because I won't get in trouble. Sure, maybe. But a lot of the time we just sort of internalize them and do them because that's the right thing to do. And you know, governments and other institutions can offer punishments, but a lot of the times they're just sort of enforcing these regulations that have already been internalized since we were children. You know, so why do people accept this internalized discipline? And for Freud, this is critical. It's the fear of loss of love. So it's not that they fear sort of getting thrown in jail and being punished. I mean, yeah, that's bad. But why is that bad psychologically, right? Why is that bad psychologically? And Freud would say that fear of loss of the community's acceptance and protection if a person breaks the rules is really what's driving this. Fear that sort of that connectivity that's underneath sort of those bonds that the Eros drive is creating. That fear of their personal relationships will be harmed or even severed, right? I mean, it's more kind of a issue of shaming and social shaming. I mean, sort of the physical consequences of getting thrown in prison are bad, especially in the US. But it's also kind of the psychological impact that we will sort of lose this connectivity. We'll lose our ability to sort of meet our need for love, and not in a romantic sense, but this larger sense of being connected to a larger community. So in Civilization and Discontents, Freud defines guilt as, quote, the most important problem in the development of civilization. And guilt plays a really important role for Freud in this reading in the maintenance of a civilized society. Freud calls guilt, quote, the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of a sense of guilt. So what does he mean here? So human guilt is really, for Freud, our feelings of aggressiveness. So those kinds of id-like impulses, a lot of times associated with the death drive, turned inward. And turning this inward, right, sort of repressing is one way, but repressing aggressiveness, repressing these aggressive desires is necessary for society to function, right? We all just can't run around and, beat up anybody or tear up anything or be destructive of anything that we just have an impulse to do, right? We couldn't function as a collective human society. So society controls these aggressive impulses. Society controls the death drive through guilt. And the ideal situation is for these aggressive drives to sublimate into productive and desired activities. I mean, there's the example of sublimating well, like the surgeon who injured animals as a child and becomes like this, uses sort of their impulses to cut and to become this well-regarded surgeon. I mean, I think a really interesting example would be like, scary movies. I mean, I when we have live class, I often, try to stop here and talk to students about, are there things that are destructive that feel so good to us? I mean, I know this is kind of gross, but hold on, and I move. But think about like picking off a scab, right? Oh, that's bad, but it feels so good. Or maybe you did this when you were a kid. You come across like an anthill and a line of ants, right? You just stomp on them, right? And I mean, it's bad. It's not like you're like the kid who harmed animals and then became a surgeon. You're stomping on some ants, but still, there's kind of like this. Oh yeah, yeah. Or you find out that the person that you used to be in a romantic relationship with is seeing somebody new. And so you get on social media and you trash their new significant other, like, oh, they're so terrible, blah, blah, blah. Right? That's very destructive, but man, it feels good. Right? But we have these kinds of impulses. And, sometimes they're not like, oh, I want to go out and kill everyone and beat them up, but sometimes it's just some ant stomping, right? Or some scab picking, right? So how do we sublimate these? How do we sublimate well? I mean, you can just repress them and then they turn into neuroses, or worst case scenario, become a serial killer, right? But, what's one way that we sublimate well? Watching horror movies, playing shoot 'em up video games. What are ways that these kinds of impulses get redirected, get sublimated in ways that don't sort of call into question community, the bonds in a community and our bonds with other individuals. So guilt is this aggressiveness turned inward. You may stomp on those ants, but you're going to kind of feel bad about it later, right? And then when you're an adult and your sense of sort of morality is much more developed than when you're a child, you look back on that and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And that wasn't good. Or, a couple years later, you think back to your ex's new significant other who you trashed. You're like, oh man, I feel so terrible about that, right? That's guilt. So human guilt is the great motivator for human good for many individuals. But some individuals suffer in civilization for Freud because the constant self discipline causes them to suffer rather than thrive. Okay? So, society forces us, so the turning inward of these aggressive drives can manifest as neuroses on individuals, the desire to inflict violence on themselves and on others. And society forces us to repress our unbridled pursuit of pleasure, eros, and our unbridled desire for destruction, thanatos, for the greater good of social cohesion. You must work a job. There's certain people that it's, okay for you to have sex with, and there's certain people you can't, like your family. Don't drink or eat in excess. Follow authority figures reasonably well. Don't burn things down. Don't hurt or kill others, right? We kind of all have to follow these rules for society to function. But some people have a really hard time. Some people, let's say it's easier for some than others. And a lot of this has to do, we could say, with sort of structural access to, to different things. But, structural inequalities obviously play into this, and how people have access to like healthcare and mental health care, that sort of thing in contemporary times would be really important. But really for Freud, a lot of your ability to do this is about how you're raised as a kid. And if you kind of have a healthy environment. And so we could say that there are certain societies where the general ways in which children are raised are better and worse in terms of dealing with these kinds of impulses and not. So different societies can make us sort of push down these impulses in better and worse ways. Like bad societies do it in ways that lead to neuroses. Like, for example, forcing individuals to repress too much without the proper alternative outlets. So you can imagine too many prohibitions, for example, on individual sexual desires in a society equals sort of extreme desire to inflict punishment on others, according to psychoanalytic theory. I mean, you could think of a society that has really strict prohibitions on, who we want to do naughty things with, can create a culture of extreme and harsh punishments, a very, prohibitive kind of culture, and a very neurotic culture, if you're not allowing individuals to fully express themselves in terms of their sexuality. Like that would be a society that is not sublimating well. So societies must successfully balance individual desires with the need of the group to sort of survive and most people be happy, right? But for Freud, societies that can't do this will eventually fall. And Freud kind of wonders in the last sentence of this essay, with the rise of fascism, with the rise of anti-Semitism and the oncoming World War II, if this is where Western civilization is headed, that we have not been able to sublimate well. Remember Freud died in 1939 on the eve of the horrors of World War I, and the very, he didn't know about the Holocaust, but it certainly was beginning. So one thing we can talk about in class is our current society a neurotic one where our desires or a neurotic one where our desires and drives are sort of repressed or sort of structured in a very unhealthy way? Or is our current society one where we sublimate relatively well to productive ends? Or maybe somewhere in between. Okay, so that is civilization and its discontents. And I want to talk just a little bit about, your second topic on Freud is the uncanny, and then also the film Get Out. So what do we mean when we call something uncanny? What does uncanny mean? So the dictionary definition is strange or mysterious, especially in an unsettling way. The psychological experience of something as strangely familiar rather than simply mysterious. And it's the strangely familiar that's important. So for Freud, the uncanny is that class of the terrifying which leads us back to something long known to us, once very familiar. And as I said, it's the strangely familiar that's important here from a Freudian perspective. So for your second group of texts on Freud, you have Freud's 1919 essay. So it's a little earlier than the other one we read, called The Uncanny, which offers a way to analyze the deeper psychological processes going on when we feel a sense of dread, when we see things like creepy dolls or robots that look a bit too human-like, but not quite human enough, and even killer clowns. Right? Actually, sort of a famous example of this you can see in the chart here is the uncanny valley. So when it dips really far below the line, sort of that it gets super, super uncanny. So something that's like not really human looking and it's not too familiar, right? Um, and anything, as it approaches humanity, like an incredibly realistic android that you can't separate from a human, that's not uncanny. But it's really kind of like this, as sort of things that resemble human get approached closer and closer to human. Like there's kind of this point at which they're kind of close, but not quite there, where it's like, oh my God, that's super creepy, right? That's the uncanny valley. So these are scary not because of our unfamiliarity with them. I mean, the unfamiliar can be scary, right? But uncanny is a little different, but precisely because of the familiarity that we have with them and sort of their realism. So objects that have both a sense of familiarity and threat at the same time are uncanny. They once seemed familiar in our childhood, and maybe when we were children we feared them, or maybe we desired them. But encountering them as adults, they are frightening because they represent the repressed, the familiar repressed that could come to light. So you have a video from a literature professor, I think at the University of Oregon, that explains Freud's idea of the uncanny in greater detail, and which should help you with your essay. So I would recommend when you do the uncanny section, watch the video first, and then read Freud's essay, and then answer the questions. And then we'll apply in class Freud's idea of the uncanny to the 2017 horror film by Jordan Peele, Get Out. You have just a short reading also, which is a Twitter feed that this guy, I think Kyle A.B. did, where he said, hey, Get Out, you could totally apply Freud's concept of the uncanny to that film. So read what he came up with. But, feel free to bring other examples from modern pop culture, especially horror films. I think, there's lots of great examples of this. I mean, there's a whole creepy doll-like subgenre of horror. And I actually think now we're seeing this sort of new subgenre of race in horror. A lot of it is Jordan Peele's work, Get Out, Us. There's the new HBO show Lovecraft Country that I think offers some really great examples to discuss in terms of how the uncanny works in sort of this American context of racial horror. So I will talk to you guys in class about civilization and its discontents and the uncanny, and maybe we can think some about what the uncanny in these horror films tells us about what America has repressed in terms of racism and its racist history, and how no, we have not been good at supplementing that. So, bye.